I am expecting that this video is going to interest Blizzard developers a lot more than it would interest players. It's a video explaining why I keep calling this upgrade system semi-borrowed power. You see, ever since Mists, Blizzard has added systems to the game that are designed to keep players logging in over the long haul. Azerite grinds, artifact power, anima, daily things in garrisons, daily quests for reputation, half-hill farm, you name it. I don't think Blizzard is going to accept a player power system that doesn't have some kind of long-haul currency attached to it, to keep dangling a carrot on a stick in front of players to keep them logging in each day. So I found a way to attach a long-haul currency to this concept of 7 different upgrade abilities, and to add an artifact weapon-like series of traits that you can purchase using the long-haul currency. When I described this to another player on YouTube, they told me that nothing I was talking about was interesting, and I have to admit, I agree with them. I did not add this long-haul currency or the traits that you can buy with it because they excite me. They don't. They're not meant to be the exciting part. The part of the semi-borrowed power system that's meant to excite players is the part they know they'll get to keep. The upgrade abilities in their repertoires. The part they don't keep? That's just Blizz bait. Heck, so is the name semi-borrowed power in general. Blizzard's developers know that borrowed power is a pain in the glutes. So they'd like to find ways to have their cake and eat it too, to compromise, to have borrowed power without having borrowed power. A name like semi-borrowed power is just what they'd be looking for. So, without further ado, I will talk about what makes the power semi-borrowed. First of all, the upgrade abilities are intended to be things that players get as they level up from 60 to 70. But each upgrade ability isn't everything that it can be at the time you get it. Maybe Exorcism doesn't deal extra damage against demons, undead, etc. when you first get it at level 63. Maybe Prismatic Spray doesn't have a random chance to cast Fire Blast or Frost Nova on your targets when you first get it at level 64. Maybe Heroic Strike isn't any cheaper in terms of rage cost than Slam is at level 61. That kind of thing. But once you hit max level and start collecting ability power, that's what I'm calling the long-haul currency, you can spend the ability power to buff your upgrades. Rank 1 has Exorcism deal 5% extra damage to undead and demons, rank 2 10%, etc. Each time you spend ability power to upgrade something, the next rank costs even more. That's a lot like how artifact trait costs kept going up with artifact weapons. The user interface that I have in mind for ability power spending is, well, actually it's a cylinder. You can scroll left or right and eventually you'll wrap around to where you started, and there is a specific reason why. Imagine there are 3 different starting points you can pick from at the base of the cylinder. Each of those starts one of 3 different paths that the player can follow, and each path has its own theme to it. Maybe single target throughput, multi-target throughput, and utility. The example I'm using is my own spec, the Holy Paladin spec, and the 3 paths are single target healing, multi-target healing, and damage/utility. Of course, different specs could have different paths: burst versus sustain, resource builders versus resource spenders, light and darkness, sun and moon, all kinds of stuff like that. But what I'd like to see for Holy Paladins is multi-target healing, single target healing, and damage/utility. Of course, that might have something to do with how the dev team took Holy Radiance away, going from Warlords into Legion, and me really, really wanting it back. But anyhow, let's say that I pick the single target healing path to start with. There are some traits that simply increase the strength of baseline healing abilities, but also some traits that buff upgrade abilities that help with single target healing. The traits that increase the strength of baseline heals, those are comparable to the basic artifact weapon traits, and those aren't the kinds of things players miss when an expansion ends, and when another expansion begins and the borrowed power system vanishes from the game. These little no-brainer traits can be the borrowed half of the semi-borrowed power system. To illustrate what I mean, when Beast Mastery Hunters were missing the buffs their Titan Strike rifles used to get them, they weren't missing things like Spitting Cobras boosting Cobra Shots damage by 10%, or Pack Leader boosting Kill Commands damage by 9%. It was the active Titan's Thunder ability, or the passive Surge of the Storm God that they were missing. Those were things that actually affected how they played. If little simple talent-esque stuff vanishes at the expansion's end, no one's going to shed a tear. It won't feel like Blizzard is taking things away from the player at the end. By contrast, the upgrade abilities themselves, and the traits that buff them into what they're supposed to be at the end, those are going to be sticking around. The buffing traits will get baked into the abilities at the expansion's end, and the plan is for players to be fully aware of that. I mean, it's much more exciting to get something you know you're going to be able to keep than it is for you to get something that you know you're going to need to give up. Of course, other things can also get added this way, like passives that can improve gameplay or add procs that shake up your rotation. It's probably better if those kinds of things stick around than it is if they disappear, provided that players actually like what those things are doing with their rotations. Technically, unpruned abilities could be placed in the cylinder, but I wouldn't recommend it. If it's in the cylinder, there's a higher chance that players will wonder if they're going to lose it at the expansion's end, and that kind of uncertainty really isn't fun. The reason why I had 3 paths on a graph that wraps around is this. With these paths, we're telling a kind of a story of character progression. My paladin learns to channel the light onto a single target more and more the deeper he goes into this first single target healing path. But there's also some flexibility. I mean, Holy Shock is a single target heal, but it's also a damage spell. So once I get to the Holy Shock trait, to say a third or half or maybe 2/3 of the way up the cylinder, I have the option of jumping over and grabbing some damage/utility traits as well, or of continuing to progress up the single target healing path. Or, for example, Beacon of Light. Beacon of Light can be considered either a single target heal or a multi-target heal, since it helps with healing the tank and it helps with healing another player. So taking a Beacon of Light trait could also function as a bridge from the single target healing path to the multi-target healing path. Heck, Fist of the Heavens, the upgrade that I had for Judgment, could function as either a multi-target heal or as a damage upgrade. It could function as a bridge between the damage/utility path and the multi-target healing path. If a player wanted, they could travel up the single target path, jog over to the side into utility, keep going horizontally until they cross the second bridge into multi-target healing, and then travel up the multi-target healing path after that, having snagged a few upgrades in the damage and utility path along the way. These progressions tell a story. How am I having my character evolve and learn and progress? How's my character adapting and growing? It's up to me what order I learn these in. That kind of agency and character growth are what RPGs are all about. And I have Soul So Breezy to thank for teaching me how important story is to these kinds of systems. Of course, one thing that makes this system simpler and much more fun is the fact that, in the end, every player will have every ability power trait. In a way, there's no hard choices to make. Unlike with conduits or covenants, you're not choosing which few traits to get and which many to forfeit. You're simply choosing which ones you're getting first. That's a much more fun decision to make than to have to choose what to forfeit. That's one of the things I really liked about artifact weapon traits. You could get everything. You were supposed to get everything with enough diligence. That's why I designed this cylinder the same way. Now, there are 2 other things I'd wanted to say, or rather, that I'd hoped Blizzard would hear. The first has more to do with the semi-borrowed power system as a whole. I think it's got a lot of potential, and the general trick of replacing abilities with other abilities is something that more than one player has dreamed up. And it lets developers add new stuff without running into spellbar bloat. That basic concept alone is so useful, so powerful, that it's hard to imagine Blizzard not doing it, whether they hear of Project Decade or not. I figure the odds are high that someone at Blizzard has already thought of a system like this. But as much as I like the concept and hope Team 2 is going to be using it in the next expansion, there is something that I hope doesn't happen. I hope that higher-ups at Activision don't force you to use my concept. Now, you might expect that being forced to use my idea would be delightful to me, but it is not. On the one hand, yes, I think it would make the game better if you took every gold copy upgrade spread that I and the volunteer curators who join me and the givers of feedback will put together. But if you were forced to use them, that would box you in. I know it's not impossible for Team 2 to come up with a system that's even better than mine, and that adds more fun to the game than mine would. Granted, the systems that have been in the game for the last several expansions have been bad, adding frustration instead of fun, often working against themselves, against other systems, against their own fundamental purposes, or even against the players. And often those systems and the way they get replaced don't respect players' time at all. But it is possible for a system to be better than mine, and I know I need to have the humility to acknowledge that. And Activision forcing you to take my idea puts a ceiling on how awesome things can get. I mean, it puts a floor on how bad things can get, but it also adds a ceiling. So Activision, if you're watching this right now and you are contemplating telling Blizzard to out and out use my semi-borrowed power concept, then don't. Please, don't. It's not quite the right move, and I honestly believe I can say that without reflecting badly on myself. My first iteration reflected badly on me already. My curator volunteers or players who will give me feedback. Don't get me wrong, I would be flattered if you thought my idea, or what feedback transforms my ideas into, was a good idea. And I would be glad that months of hard work had some kind of payoff, but it's not the payoff I think is best for the game and for morale at Team 2. The most you should do with regard to this concept is this. Number 1, tell Team 2 to treat my system as a fallback plan. Number 2, tell Team 2 to announce their actual plans early enough so that they can pivot and use my ideas if they get unhappy feedback from players on their actual plans. Number 3, only make them pivot and use my idea if their own ideas are rejected by players after they've shown them. I don't want this to become a ceiling for how awesome the game can be. I'd prefer it to be a floor that limits how bad it can be. I mean, the scenario I keep talking about in my videos is where leadership and the vision around it have been removed from Team 2 thanks to all the chaos that's happening at Blizzard, and the team either has no internal leader or has a leader who's in way over their heads. They need direction, and they need it now. It's do or die time for the franchise. And if there's no vision, then someone sees Project Decade, decides to do it, they've got a vision, and the day is saved. Well, that's a narrative where I'm the hero. Everyone likes to be in a story starring themselves in the hero role. It's one of the reasons why World of Warcraft got to be as popular as it is. But what makes the narrative I just spun good is the fact that you, the developers, you chose Project Decade. That decision wasn't made for you. I mean, if I were a Blizzard developer and I had players' ideas forced down my throat, I wouldn't be happy about that. Don't get me wrong, I've seen plenty of decisions from the development team that looked wrong to me and that made me feel unhappy, like Denounce and Holy Radiance getting pruned. I wouldn't be making this series if that wasn't the case. But there has already been enough to damage the morale at Team 2. And I would prefer not to be the reason that morale gets any lower. I'd rather be the reason it goes up. I mean, heck, improving morale is one of the big reasons why I'm doing Project Decade in the first place. That leads me to the second thing that I'd like the Blizzard devs to hear. I know that in life there is a pattern that I like to call WEFMO. Worst examples form most opinions. I mean, pick a group of people, any group, whether it's a religious group, an ethnic group, a political group, a fandom, a school, a city, a sport, a profession, anything that you can group people into. It's the worst examples of that group that you hear about, and that get the most attention and that play the biggest roles in forming people's opinions about the group. It's not the charities that provide clean water in third world countries that the Catholic Church runs that you hear about. It's priests assaulting kids that you hear about. It's not the Steven Universe fans who browse lists of gemstone species and speculate on what the next fusion's going to be that you hear about. It's the ones that bully fan artists to death that you hear about. It's not attorneys that put their livelihood on the line to bring justice in a court of law you hear about. It's the slimy ones that twist people's words and get rich by getting guilty criminals off the hook that you hear about. And when I heard that there were players who were doxing one team member's family, I was worried. I was worried that Team 2 would conclude that all of us players are entitled, jerkish, horrible, vengeful idiots with nothing better to do than to bully developers. The nice players are not the ones that make themselves stand out and get attention. It's the bullies that do that. And I worry that they're the ones that are forming your opinion of us. Kind of like how the harassers and whichever unknown Blizzard big shots who've been letting their ego wreck the game for the last several expansions are forming all too many players' opinions of what Blizzard developers are like. I, for one, know that most Blizzard employees are not like that. And I know that doxing is way crossing the line. And I know that bullying to get something that I want to happen, or to be in or out of the game, or your office for that matter, is just plain wrong. And I very strongly believe that the vast majority of players agree with me on this. It is my hope that the worst examples of us players have not formed most of the opinions about us among those of you at Team 2, and it's also my hope that Project Decade has done something to counteract that opinion. That's basically what I'd hoped to convey to Blizzard. This video definitely grew beyond what I'd planned at first. It started out as discussing what could be purchased with the long-haul ability power currency attached to my proposed semi-borrowed power system, and how it could be used, and how the whole proposal could be semi-borrowed power, as opposed to being entirely borrowed or entirely kept. To be honest, my proposal does lean in the direction of keeping as much as possible, but that's because the more players know they're going to be allowed to keep, the more fun it'll be to get stuff. Hopefully that'll be a principal Team 2 can find a good balance on going forward, and I hope I have helped them to find that balance.